So as we get further and settled into the War Within, I've been running a lot of heroic dungeons, aiming to gear up for raiding and having great fun doing so. And it seems that every dungeon brings something new. I don't think there's any real disappointments or stinkers in there, I'd say. So I thought I'd have some fun based on my early impressions of the 8 brand spanking new dungeons in the War Within, and rank them from worst to best. But beforehand, I think it's still worth noting that I enjoy all these dungeons in their own way, and these are some of the best dungeons in my opinion that retailers had to offer in quite a while, and I think they're all great. Now with that disclaimer out of the way, let's get to trashing some dungeons. Now at the bottom of the list at number 8 is Darkflame Cleft. Now I like the idea of this dungeon and the fact that kobolds have been brought back as an endgame enemy, coming a long way from Elwyn Forest, but something about this dungeon just doesn't quite hit it for me, as I think it feels more like they couldn't decide if they wanted this to be a delve or a dungeon, and that seeps into the boss fights not really feeling notable in many ways, more like you're just helping out and not actually clearing a dungeon. I'm also not a fan of boss fights where the HP is so large you don't know how much is left, and you don't end up even clearing out the HP of the boss. Notable on the final boss of the instance, the Darkness. No, not the hit 2000s rock band, the endgame boss of this dungeon. However, I do really enjoy the last point when you're racing through the mine in the minecart throwing dynamite at the Darkness, which is good fun, and I quite like the kobold in the dungeon who helps the campaign, and sounds like a mix of Jar Jar Binks and Gollum, but for me it is bottom of the list. Now, next at number 7 is the Dawnbreaker. Originally I thought this would be the worst dungeon on the list due to how horrible the mechanics of dynamic flying work, alongside trying to land on different airships where you can literally fly through them, get trapped inside them and have to quit the instance. Good fun. Or maybe the fact you just randomly die in various zones if you're there for slightly too long, even if that is a flight path for the area. Or maybe again it's having a boss with 1 billion health that doesn't quite fully make sense in terms of a final encounter. Or maybe it's the second boss where it's easier to just nuke down 150 million HP instead of killing the generals like you're meant to. Generally speaking, this instance isn't epic enough in nature to demand that you put up with this. It's a 3 boss instance that, to put it politely, is a pain in the ass. But in saying that, you can't deny that visually it is great, and to be honest it does feel like a different style of dungeon that tried to add in the use of dynamic flying, in contrast to older dungeons where you would simply have an NPC flying mount. And realistically the dungeon is a lot more memorable than Darkflame Cleft. But in saying all of that, there are too many technical faults for this dungeon to put it higher up on the list. Now at number 6 on the list is the Rookery. The Rookery was the first dungeon I did in the War Within, and it was a great introduction as the vibe and aesthetic really matches the core essence of the War Within, fighting some slightly twisted earthen and riding some Stormbrook mounts into battle. The progression of this dungeon is pretty classic Warcraft, with the first 2 bosses feeling fresh and new, and I really enjoy these encounters, and how you progress down a huge building as a large ball of lightning. It's not a huge feature of the instance as a whole, but it's a nice touch to get you down rather than just having slow fall, for example. However, the only thing that massively lets down this for me is the last boss. It's just a big void boss made out of stone and doesn't really feel special, unlike the rest of the dungeon. It feels like it would have been more epic having even the second or first boss of the dungeon as the final encounter of the instance instead. And unfortunately for me, that means while the rest of the dungeon is really great, it doesn't have a satisfying end to it for me, which left me wanting more, and also a bit confused when I first finished the dungeon thinking, oh wait, that was it? Now in 5th place for me is City of Echoes. City of Echoes is a good solid dungeon that's reflective of classic old fighting Nerubians in a lot of webs that makes you feel like you're back in Wrath of the Lich King. It's easy to progress through, straightforward, does everything a classic dungeon for World of Warcraft should do, and ultimately is a lot of fun. The bosses are engaging and the visuals of the dungeon are on point, matching the vibe of the zone, i.e. a Nerubian stronghold. However, the only very annoying thing is clearly a trinket is on farm for the first boss, and tanks and healers will regularly leave this dungeon after the first boss, and you have to regroup almost instantly. But that's a social issue, not to do with the dungeon, so you can't take away due to that. And for City of Echoes, I don't really have much bad to say about it. I like it and I'm happy to run it every time it pops up. I suppose the only thing lacking is that bit of extra spice that the dungeon needs, maybe to pop it up a few places higher on the list. But it's a solid dungeon and could easily be a long-term favourite for the expansion, for myself. Now at 4th is Cinderbrew Meadery. At first I couldn't really decide where to place this dungeon, as I feel it could be one that you either love or absolutely hate. And at first I thought it would be lower on the list, but after really thinking about it and running the dungeon a few times more, I do inherently enjoy the goofy aspects to this dungeon that feel a lot like those smaller jokes or patterns of lightheartedness that are woven into World of Warcraft since vanilla. And this dungeon does feel like it's straight out of either one of the quirkier aspects of a long lost vanilla questline, or definitely out of Mists of Pandaria. And overall the boss fights are engaging and the last boss does feel well built up too, and it sure does feel like you're fighting and retaking a meadery for the right reasons, if you'd ever need to do that, giving the most important aspect complete in the dungeon for me, a satisfactory ending. Although the instance is quite small, the progression in it still works, and it provides a different vibe to the rest of the dungeons available in the War Within, and manages to pull it off for me. Sitting in third place for me is City of Threads. City of Threads to me expands on what I mentioned about City of Echoes. It's a good dungeon fighting Nerubians that would feel in place for Wrath, and does everything a classic dungeon for World of Warcraft should do, and ultimately is a lot of fun. Yet Threads provides that extra little bit of spice that Echoes doesn't, due to an expansive nature of the instance, where you are quite literally running through a huge Nerubian city and infiltrating its stronghold. And while at first certain aspects of this dungeon were a pain, like finding the agents, once you get to grips with it and understand you just follow the shadow figures, this is actually a pretty fun little side mission within the dungeon to continue pressing ahead. And ultimately the grand scale of the dungeon feels like it's done right this time, in comparison to previous instances in the past that I never gelled with, like Court of the Stars in Legion that always fell slightly short for the payoff in my opinion. City of Threads is a grand scale dungeon that feels well woven into the campaign of the War Within, where you actually feel like you are taking out some high level Nerubians while shiftily sneaking around their city, and is a great addition to the War Within to give some variance in terms of instance size. Now at number 2 is the Stonevault. Much similar to City of Echoes, the Stonevault feels like a solid Warcraft dungeon that does all the basics of a dungeon really well. I love the wing system set off from the center room where you can basically choose which of the middle 2 bosses you want to do first, with a nice cart system to get you back to the main room. And for me, having Void Corrupted Earthen absolutely blasting the life out of everyone with huge waves of void damage does feel like a worthy last boss of the instance. And aesthetically, this dungeon looks absolutely great. Honestly, you could be forgiven for thinking this was a new dungeon set in Ironforge, and it feels right in place for World of Warcraft, and it could have been something in the earlier stages of WoW's life cycle about 20 years ago, really reminding me of a lot of the dungeons held in Blackrock Mountain, but obviously kicked into 2024 with a new retail WoW haircut. The Stonevault for me kind of epitomises how you are still able to play out classic aspects of Warcraft that we all love and get them right even in a modern version of the game. For me, it really set the tone for the War Within, and is one of the dungeons that made me think this would be a great expansion. And what can I say? I'm a sucker for some dwarven nostalgia. Now sitting at number 1 and the best dungeon of the War Within for me is Priory of the Sacred Flame. Being completely honest, this was the easiest pick for me when ordering my favourite dungeons in the expansion. As Priory of the Sacred Flame, much like Stonevault, this dungeon to me truly does feel like Scarlet Monastery with some retail WoW lipstick on, as you're fighting some corrupted bringers of the light who justify their evil doings with the aims of fighting the Void and Nerubians and carry out doing some questionable things. Essentially, you fight a bunch of evil paladins in a huge monastery that looks absolutely epic and feels much like a throwback to those days of fighting the Scarlet Crusade, who felt completely justified in their actions in the names of fighting the Scourge. And much like the Stonevault, Priory of the Sacred Flame completely shows to me that you can do classic themes of Warcraft, or create new instances for WoW that still do fit the aspects of what made WoW so great back in vanilla, as there's nothing quite like storming a gothic looking stronghold and wading through waves of evil turned good doers. Running through the whole instance feels epic due to the impressive stature of the buildings and the halls that you run through, where the boss fights are set up well throughout and you can charge straight into the Citadel to take out the big cheese herself. For me, I just wish this instance dropped some cooler looking gear, if you will, but realistically I'm not going to take away from the actual experience of it because of the loot, and for me that's why Priory of the Sacred Flame gets the big old gold star. Congrats to you, Priory of the Sacred Flame, you deserve it. So there's my ranking of the new dungeons that we have in the War Within, and much like all opinions, I'm sure this will have infuriated someone somewhere somehow, so do be sure to let me know what you've made of the new dungeons and drop your ranking in the comments below. But till next time, take care out there, and I'll see you on the next one. Ta-ra for now.
As always, if you're new here, feel free to like and subscribe, and on that note, I think I'll say ta-ra for now, and I'll see you later.